Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out the latest RDNA 2 based graphics card to hit the market. That is AMD's RX 6700 XT. This GPU was announced at the beginning of the month and it is targeted squarely at 1440p gamers. That also means it is on a collision course with Nvidia's RTX 3060 Ti and RTX 3070. Now, we have already covered the key specs of this card, so I'm not going to recap that here, but if you do want to catch up on that information, I'll leave a link in the video description where we go over everything you need to know. We do have one new piece of information though, and that is UK pricing. AMD told us the UK MSRP for the 6700 XT is going to be £419.99, so that is pretty neatly in between the 3060 Ti and the 3070. Of course, MSRPs don't really mean anything these days, but it does tell us how AMD is positioning the product. So let's crack on and see how it compares to the competition. To do so, we are using our regular GPU test system provided to us by PC Specialist. This is built around an Intel i9-10900K overclocked to 5.1 GHz on all cores. That is paired with the Asus ROG Maximus 12 Hero motherboard and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 memory clocked at 3600 MHz. For our testing today, AMD provided us with the Adrenalin 20.50 driver. We're also going to be focusing on 1080p and 1440p data in this video because that's actually what you guys said you were most interested for a GPU of this caliber, but we did also test 4K, so if you want to see all of those benchmarks, head over to kitguru.net. Getting things started though with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Believe it or not, this is actually the game where we saw the RX 6700 XT do its best versus the RTX 3070 and the 3060 Ti. At 1080p for instance, its average of 93 FPS is 11% ahead of the RTX 3070 and 18% faster than the RTX 3060 Ti. Up at 1440p, the Nvidia GPUs do catch up though, as here the 6700 XT averaged 73 FPS, and that is now just 4% faster than the RTX 3070, but still 16% faster than the RTX 3060 Ti. Compared to the RX 6800 as well, it is 9% slower. Remedy's control, however, is the polar opposite of what we saw from Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At 1080p, the RX 6700 XT is 3 FPS slower than the RTX 3060 Ti, averaging 109 FPS. That also makes it 16% slower than the RTX 3070 and 20% slower than its big brother, the RX 6800. So that is quite the turnaround. As for 1440p, here the 6700 XT is still very playable, averaging 70 FPS, but that makes it 3% slower than the RTX 3060 Ti, and that is a GPU which should cost about £50 less based on the MSRP prices. Next up, we come to Cyberpunk 2077, and this is the most demanding game of all 12 we're testing today. At 1080p, the RX 6700 XT delivers 86 FPS on average, meaning it sits pretty neatly between the 3060 Ti and the 3070. That scaling also holds at 1440p, where the 6700 XT is 8% slower than the 3070, but 8% faster than the 3060 Ti. It can't quite manage 60 FPS here though it's the only game of all 12 we tested where it didn't hit 60 FPS at 1440p. Moving now on to Dirt 5. At 1080p, the RX 6700 XT comes in 11% slower than the RX 6800, delivering 115 FPS on average. That's just an extra 5 frames compared to the RTX 3060 Ti, while it's also 6% behind the RTX 3070. Up at 1440p now, the scaling hasn't changed at all, as the 6700 XT is still 5% faster than the 3060 Ti and 6% slower than the 3070. Either way, an average frame rate of 91 FPS is still very smooth at this resolution. As for The Division 2 now, despite being an AMD title, at 1080p we can see the 6700 XT is trailing the RTX 3070 by a 12% margin, while it's also just a single frame faster than the 3060 Ti. Up against the RX 6800, we're looking at a pretty large 20% gap between the two. As for 1440p, the 6700 XT even falls behind the 3060 Ti, hitting 90 FPS on average. It's hardly a big difference there, but it is also now 15% slower than the RTX 3070, when that difference was 12% at 1080p. As one of the least demanding games we test, F1 2020 sees the 6700 XT average 189 FPS at 1080p, so it's just 6% behind the RTX 3070. It is also 6% faster than the 3060 Ti here, so bang in the middle between those two GeForce GPUs. The 6700 XT does fall away at 1440p though, where it hits 142 FPS on average, meaning it is now 10% slower than the RTX 3070. The 5 FPS lead it has over the 3060 Ti is a difference of just 4%. Gears 5 now is another AMD title, but just like the Division 2, the 6700 XT actually doesn't do so well here. The performance is still solid at 1080p, delivering 111 FPS on average, and that's 5% more frames than the 3060 Ti. At 1440p though, the performance does drop off, to the point where there's only a single frame between the 6700 XT and the 3060 Ti. Compared to the RTX 3070, AMD's new mid-range GPU is 12% slower. As for Hitman 3, despite not being an officially AMD-sponsored title, AMD GPUs do really well in this game, and at 1080p, the 6700 XT is effectively matching the performance of the RTX 3070, as there's only a single frame difference between the two. It's also 11% faster than the 3060 Ti here, which itself managed 166 FPS. As for 1440p, it's again very close, though the 6700 XT is now 4% slower than the RTX 3070. I'd still call that close enough to be an irrelevant difference though, and we can also see the 6700 XT is still 9% faster than the 3060 Ti. Moving on then from one AMD friendly game to a title that definitely favours GeForce hardware. In Metro Exodus, at 1080p, the 6700 XT is 14% slower than the RTX 3070, and it's even a touch behind the 3060 Ti. Granted, it is still delivering great frame rates, but we would have hoped for better performance relative to those Nvidia GPUs. The same thing can also be said for 1440p. Here, the 6700 XT is soundly beaten by the RTX 3070 to the tune of 15%, while it just about matches the 3060 Ti, with both around the 116 FPS mark. Compared to the RX 6800, we're looking at another 20% deficit. Next up, we have Red Dead Redemption 2, and this is another very demanding title when using ultra settings, but even then, at 1080p, the 6700 XT is doing well. Its average of 77 FPS is pretty much on par with the RTX 3070, and it's also a solid 10% ahead of the 3060 Ti, so really not bad at all. As we have seen from a number of games though, at 1440p the 6700 XT does fall away relative to its competition. Here, its average of 63 FPS is 6% slower than the RTX 3070, when it was 3% slower at 1080p. It's not a big difference, granted, but it is a pretty reliable trend from across all 12 games we tested. As for Total War Saga Troy, AMD GPUs rarely do well in this game, and unfortunately for Team Red, that is again the case here. At 1080p, the 6700 XT is averaging 94 FPS, which certainly isn't bad in itself, but it's 17% slower than the RTX 3070, and even 8% behind the 3060 Ti, and that's a card which is meant to be £50 cheaper. Up at 1440p, things get even worse for Team Red, as the gap between the 6700 XT and the RTX 3070 has widened to 20%, while we're also looking at an 11% deficit compared to the 3060 Ti. Finally, as the last of our 12 games, we come to Watch Dogs Legion. Despite being an Nvidia sponsored title, the results for the 6700 XT aren't bad at all. It's only 3 FPS slower than the RTX 3070 at 1080p, and it sits 8% above the 3060 Ti. As for 1440p, here the 6700 XT averaged just below 70 FPS, which means it is now 7% slower than the RTX 3070. It still holds a small lead over the 3060 Ti, however, and it is 12% slower than the RX 6800. So that is it for the game-by-game benchmarks, and before we get to the big picture overview, I do want to just point out a little trend which I noticed. The most interesting thing for me was comparing the 6700 XT to the 6800. Usually when we're comparing two cards of the same generation using the same architecture, we get pretty consistent scaling between the two. Take the RX 5700 XT and the 5700 for instance. There, across our testing, we're seeing a very consistent 12% gap between those two GPUs. With the 6700 XT and the 6800, however, we're not quite seeing the same thing. The 6700 XT can come in anywhere between 9% slower in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, all the way up to 23% slower in Gears 5. Without being able to say for certain, I think this comes down to the fact that the 6700 XT has a third fewer cores than the 6800, but significantly higher clocks. So that means depending whether a game is more clock speed sensitive or whether it favours more cores, we can see a fairly reasonable difference between those two cards. Looking now at the big picture overview with our 12 game average FPS, we'll start off with the 1080p data. Here we can see the RX 6700 XT is on average 8% slower than the RTX 3070 and 4% faster than the RTX 3060 Ti. It is also 15% slower than its big brother, the RX 6800, and compared to the RX 5700 XT, we're looking at a generational uplift of 25%. As for 1440p, and remember this is the resolution AMD was really targeting for this GPU, here we can see the 6700 XT is 10% slower than the RTX 3070 and just 2% ahead of the 3060 Ti. It is also 18% slower than the RX 6800, and up against the RX 5700 XT, it delivers an extra 26% performance. Using the £419.99 UK MSRP, we can also take a look at cost per frame. Again, this is fairly academic at the minute since MSRP doesn't really mean a lot, but it does tell us how AMD is trying to position the product. At 1080p, the 6700 XT delivers a cost per frame of £3.47, and that's 3% better value than the RTX 3070. Compared to the RTX 3060 Ti, however, this 6700 XT is 9% more expensive per frame. Using the 1440p data now, here the RTX 3070 and RX 6700 XT converge to the point where the cost per frame values differ by just 1 pence, and that really is an irrelevant margin. Again though, nothing is beating the value offered by the 3060 Ti, as the 6700 XT is now 11% more expensive per frame. One thing to point out here as well is that the 6700 XT has actually been thrown a lifeline by the UK MSRP. That's because, based on the US dollar pricing, the 6700 XT is actually worse value across the board when compared to the 3070, and against the 3060 Ti, its relative value gets even worse. Here at KitGuru, we are of course a UK publication, so it makes sense for us to use the prices in British pounds, but if you are based in the US or another location, it's definitely worth bearing in mind that the cost per frame may vary depending on the MSRPs in your area. Next up, we have the small topic of ray tracing to cover. So the 6700 XT is equipped with 40 ray accelerators, and here we're going to test Control, Metro Exodus and Watch Dogs Legion to see how this GPU compares to the competition. Starting off with Control then, here the 6700 XT only delivers a playable frame rate at 1080p, offering 49 FPS on average with ray tracing set to high. That's a huge frame rate drop compared to playing with ray tracing disabled, however, as we're looking at a 55% hit to performance. We can also see the 6700 XT is only just faster than the RTX 2060 Super, and that's a £379 GPU from mid-2019. NVIDIA GPUs do also have the option of DLSS in this game, something AMD currently has no answer for. At 1080p, we can see the RTX 3060 Ti is able to hit 109 FPS on average using DLSS quality mode with ray tracing set to high. That's the same level of performance as the 6700 XT running with no ray tracing at all, so it's a clear advantage for Nvidia in this title. Next up is Metro Exodus, and here it is worth saying we did experience a number of crashes when using DXR in this game, but eventually we managed to gather the necessary data. At 1080p, the 6700 XT averaged 91 FPS with ray tracing set to ultra, putting it on par with the RTX 3060 and the 2070 Super. Compared to the 3060 Ti, however, it does come in 20% slower. I would also say 1440p gaming with ray tracing is just about possible here, with the 6700 XT averaging 56 FPS, though the 1% lows drop down to 40 FPS. Again though, compared to the 3060 Ti, AMD's GPU is 24% slower with ray tracing enabled. Finally, Watch Dogs Legion with ray tracing is pretty punishing for the 6700 XT. The frame rate drops by 58% when those ray trace reflections are set to ultra, and even then the 3060 is still the faster GPU, while the 6700 XT is barely ahead of the 2060 Super. It is also a huge 28% slower than the 3060 Ti here. That margin can also be extended by the 3060 Ti thanks to DLSS 2.0. Using that technology in tandem with ray tracing sees the 3060 Ti come in 87% faster at 1080p for, frankly, very little difference in visual quality. DLSS really is a big value add for Ampere GPUs, and it's something we desperately need to see a response to from AMD. The final area of gaming performance we're going to cover is SAM, or Smart Access Memory. This technology first debuted with the RX 6800 series back in November, and it's effectively AMD's implementation of resizable bar. Now, the keen-eyed amongst you will know that I'm using an Intel-based test system when officially you need a Ryzen 5000 system or Ryzen 3000 CPU with a 500 series motherboard. So technically I don't actually meet the official criteria set out by AMD, but my ZIF 190 motherboard does support resizable bar, so I figured I'd test it anyway and see what happens. Bearing that in mind, the results may vary when compared to a system that does meet the official SAM criteria, but again, I just wanted to see what would happen. So, without going through every single game again, of the 12 we tested, we found performance for the 6700 XT actually increased by up to 6% with SAM enabled, and there was only one game where performance got worse, and that was Watch Dogs Legion, and even then it was a difference of a single frame. Gears 5, Red Dead Redemption 2 and Assassin's Creed Valhalla all saw 5% improvements, though there were also 3 of our games which didn't see any benefit at all. Overall, across the 12 games, on average, SAM increased our frame rate by 2%, so it's hardly a significant difference and certainly isn't enough to change our overall conclusion, but it is something. Leaving gaming performance behind us now, we're going to move on to talk about AMD's reference card. It's clearly got the same design language as the reference RX 6800, with a metal shroud and backplate in that striking silver and black combination. There are, however, 2 fans here instead of 3, and these also measure 85mm compared to 80mm fans on the 6800. Another important thing I felt that was worth noting is the stark weight difference between these 2 cards. The 6700 XT comes in at 891 grams on our scale, compared to 1390 grams for the 6800, so that indicates a significant reduction in heatsink mass. Let's see how well this reference card stacks up then. The first thing I want to start off with is the operating speeds of the 6700 XT. Here it is no surprise to see the GPU running at a much higher clock speed than any other GPU we have tested. AMD claims a game clock of 2424 MHz, and actually over the duration of our 30-minute stress test, we saw it manage an average frequency of 2501 MHz. That is a significantly higher frequency than the RX 6800 as you can see here, and it also seems significantly more stable, with fewer and less significant downward spikes compared to the 6800. As for default thermal performance now, here the reference RX 6700 XT saw a GPU edge temperature of 77 degrees during our testing. This is a few degrees hotter than the RX 6800, but the cooler is substantially lighter despite just an 8% reduction in rated power draw. We've not charted the hotspot temperature as currently we've only tested one 6700 XT, but for reference it hit 98 degrees. Moving on to out of the box noise, default behaviour saw the two fans spin up to 49%, which is around 1680 RPM. Either way, for a reference card it is a great result and marks a 10 decibel reduction in noise compared to the reference 5700 XT, so AMD's coolers clearly have come a long way from the blower style cards of old. With stock noise levels hitting 38 decibels, there is clearly some room to increase fan speed when noise normalising, therefore dropping temperatures. In this case, we had to increase fan speed to 54% or 1850 RPM. That reduced both the edge temperature and the hotspot by 4 degrees, which isn't much, but it's better than nothing. We'll of course see how custom cards from the likes of Sapphire and Gigabyte compare in the coming weeks. Graphics card only power draw is another important area to look at, and for the 6700 XT we can see it averaged 222 watts over our testing, and that's just an 8 watt reduction versus the RX 6800. That puts it 5 watts higher than the RTX 3070 as well, so that really doesn't bode well for overall efficiency considering the 3070 is the faster card. Based on that, we can see performance per watt for the 6700 XT is good, but definitely behind its nearest rivals. At 1080p, we're looking at a reduction in efficiency of 8% compared to the RTX 3070 and 3060 Ti, while that increases to 11% versus the 6800, and that's still the most efficient GPU on our chart. The same goes at 1440p, where the 6700 XT delivers 11% less performance per watt than both the 3060 Ti and the 3070. We can also see it's lagging behind the 6800 by 15%. We are still looking at a generational improvement to efficiency, as performance per watt is up 22% compared to the 5700 XT, but it just can't quite match its current generation competitors. Finally, we come to manual overclocking, and here headroom was actually surprisingly decent, despite the fact that the 6700 XT is already coming with pretty high clock speeds out of the box. Using AMD's driver-based software, I pushed the power limit up to 115% and was therefore able to push the core frequency up to 2900 MHz, with the memory at 2130 MHz. This increased our real-world average clock speed by 285 MHz, very nearly reaching 2.8 GHz on the core. As a result of this increased frequency, we saw an 8% boost to frame rates in both F1 2020 and Gears 5 when testing at 1440p. In Watch Dogs Legion, we still saw an extra 6% performance. Power draw, meanwhile, increased by 21 watts when overclocked, so that's an extra 9% compared to stock behaviour. Alrighty then, so that is really it for all of our testing today, and it's time to wrap up. Overall, I have to say I am a bit disappointed in what AMD has done with the 6700 XT. Based on the slides we saw during the announcement, I was genuinely hopeful that this GPU could be faster than the RTX 3070, but that simply did not materialise. In fact, at 1440p it is just 2% faster on average when compared to the 3060 Ti, and that means it is 10% slower than the RTX 3070. What that means for overall value of the card is that the 6700 XT and RTX 3070 are effectively dead level in terms of cost per frame, but the 3070 is simply miles ahead when it comes to ray tracing, and it also has DLSS support as well. The 3060 Ti, on the other hand, is clearly the better value GPU in terms of rasterization, and that's before we even factor in the ray tracing performance, which is still better than the 6700 XT. The fact that the UK MSRP is £420 definitely helps the 6700 XT, as based on the dollar pricing, the value is even worse, as the 3070 offers better cost per frame at 1080p and 1440p. Even then, I really think that AMD's GPUs need to deliver more rasterization performance at a lower price when compared to Nvidia, and that's just to counteract the extra value adds of ray tracing and DLSS, both of which are lacking for AMD's GPUs. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think the 6700 XT is a bad card. It's actually a really solid card for 1440p gaming, as it delivered 60 FPS in every game we tested apart from Cyberpunk 2077, though that one is understandable. For me, I think AMD has just looked at the current situation and thought, you know what, it doesn't really matter what we set our MSRP at, as the cards are all going to sell out. And that is true, but the MSRP is really telling us how AMD is trying to position this card. And for me, against the 3060 Ti, I just don't think it's a better buy, as the 3060 Ti can almost match the rasterization performance, coming in just 2% slower on average, while it delivers significantly better ray tracing performance with DLSS as well. So that is going to do it for my review, guys. If you liked it, toss me a thumbs up, and as always, do let me know your thoughts down in the comments. What do you make of the 6700 XT, and could you see a scenario where you would rather buy this card than something from Nvidia? While you're there, why not check out a link to our merch store in the description, and you can also join us on Discord, where we'd love to chat with you guys. It'd also be awesome if you would consider backing us on Patreon, where you can see some of our content early and even get access to some exclusive giveaways. Anyway, that is it for this video. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.